Hey guys, welcome to the Filming with Josh podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Milligan, and this is episode number 117, When Expectations Outpace Reality.
This is the Filming with Josh podcast, brought to you by Rustic River Media. Welcome to the videographer's home for tips, tricks, and how to make flicks.
Thanks again, guys, for joining another episode of the Filming with Josh podcast. If you are new to the podcast, I want to thank you for joining in. And for those of you who have been following for years, thank you for tuning in for another episode. If you are new, just note that we do have a Facebook group called Filming with Josh. So if you are on Facebook, you can go there and ask to join the group. Today, it is a place where you can share your work, ask for feedback, look at behind the scenes photos I'm posting or things that I'm working on, and just chat with people about video production. I hope to see you all there. Today's podcast is about when expectations outpace reality. And if you didn't read the description of the podcast, you might be wondering what this podcast is about. And well, it's really about client expectations versus what is feasible for the amount of people and the amount of money that they may have in mind. I want to do today's podcast because I am seeing a concerning trend. And this has been a trend that has been going on for a long time, but this year it's picked up steam, and I want to talk a little bit about that. For context, for those of you who are new to the podcast, I've been doing video professionally for about 14 years or so. And I started a different company under a different name back when I was in college, and then I rebranded as Rustic River Media in 2015. And I've been running this business for, well, it's July now, so now it makes 11 years because I started it 11 years ago in July. So we are celebrating our 11th year anniversary. And I've been shooting professionally for a few years prior to that under a different name. And so with that in mind, I have seen the industry go through some different changes over the past decade plus. And I've seen some different trends as well, right? Over the last decade plus, the way that people consume media, the way that media is produced, the amount of media that is produced or that is needed has evolved, as we all know, right? People are consuming media at an all-time high, and there is just this constant need for content creation, whether you are creating commercials, whether you are doing corporate work, whether you are doing social media content creation, whether you're focused on doc films, whatever area of the business you're in, there's just this constant need. There's all these streaming platforms that need new series and material and docs to play. Then you have, people scrolling through their phone, looking at different Instagram reels or TikToks every day. And then all the stuff that happens in between, client websites or event coverage recapping. I mean, there's just so many different places where media is being consumed. And so the need for media creation is at an all-time high, and that has only increased as the years go by. And within the lines of that content creation is the expectation of what that media looks like. Like, for example, many years ago, right when I was getting started in the industry, we didn't have drones, or at least drones that were accessible like they are now. And so at that time, if you wanted an aerial shot, you had to rent a helicopter and have a specific type of rig that you mounted your camera to get that shot. If you want to see like a classic example of the difference of what media used to look like, now I'm going back a lot further than just 10 or 15 years ago, but go look at Braveheart. I watch Braveheart every year. It's one of my favorite movies. And the opening shot of Braveheart at the very beginning of the first scene of the movie is this beautiful aerial shot of the mountainside in Scotland, or what is, I don't know if it actually was Scotland. I'm not sure where they shot that at. I should probably figure that out. But anyway, that opening shot was clearly done in a helicopter because they didn't have drones back then. And it's kind of shaky and bumpy, right? Nowadays, you can get a much crisper, much cleaner shot that doesn't have all those shakes and bumps, and you could do it with a fairly inexpensive drone, whereas back then that shot probably cost, I don't even want to put a number to it, but a ton of money, because you would have had to rent a helicopter, pay for the fuel costs, have a pilot and all that. You had to have this special rig that can mount the specialized camera to get that shot. So just for example, when you look at aerial shots, that has evolved dramatically over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And now anybody can go buy a drone and get a drone license and start offering drone shots in their work. And because of that, it is kind of expected with a lot of clients that you're going to show up and have an ability to get aerial shots of whatever it is that you're working on. Same is true with gimbals. There used to not be gimbals, and people would have to use like a dolly, or if they were trying to follow some action, they'd have to use something like a Steadicam, right? And you had to have a certain skill set to be able to operate those things. You had to have the knowledge of the gear. You had to have the gear. You had to have people to help you do all that. Now you can get a gimbal, and maybe it's not the exact same thing, but you can get pretty close to it by yourself as a single person. And so again, that has changed dramatically in terms of what the expectations are of what kind of shots you're going to get for video. Same is true for photography, right? The photography world has gone from we need, a certain number of images for a portfolio to now we need to have hundreds and hundreds of images every year to post on social media, and we need them really quickly, right? Turnaround times on photography used to be understood that it would take a while to get photos edited and delivered. Now people want photography done a lot of times even same day, because the need for content is at an all-time high, and the expectation is that you're going to show up and be able to, let's just say you're doing a corporate event, for example, that you're going to be able to capture all these different things as a single individual, and then be able to quickly cull through, have some images ready for social, and then have the actual main gallery with all the rest of the photos delivered within like a week or so. So you're just seeing this like massive shift in the industry where the expectations have dramatically changed. And what I have noticed, and this year in particular has been probably the most disruptive year to my business when it comes to this, and that is that I am seeing this major shift on client expectations versus what their budgets are and how many people they want you to show up with to do the job. Over the years, you've heard people probably talk about this if you've been in the industry for any length of time, how crew sizes have shrank, right? And that is very true. Not on every job, of course, but by and large, across the media creation world, crew sizes are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Some of that has to do with technology, like the ability to have drone shots, for example, versus needing a whole crew to pull off a helicopter aerial shot. So some of it has to do with technology, but some of it has to do with the fact that you're just expected to have the ability to do a bunch of different things with a very, very small crew. For example, we all have been called, or maybe not all of us, but if you're doing video at all, you probably have gotten the call from a corporate company or some sort of business that is looking to have some interviews done. And there are some clients who understand that you're going to show up and probably have someone dedicated toward capturing the sound and someone dedicated toward setting up lighting, maybe even multiple people. If you have like a gaffer and a grip, for example, they might expect a camera operator to show up, maybe even a first AC, and then you have usually a DP there, maybe even a director. Like back in the day, that would be the norm, and that still is the norm on certain types of jobs. But how many of you listening to this podcast have gotten a call where the expectation is the opposite, that you are going to show up as a single individual and be able to do all your own lighting, all your own sound, all your own camera work, pull your own focus or rely on autofocus, and also direct or at least co-direct with the client the interview, right? Like you're responsible for all that. You're your own DIT. You are offloading the footage and organizing it yourself. You might even be doing all your own editing. And so as a result, you are wearing so many different hats as opposed to spreading the load out on dedicated individuals who have a specific role within that production and show up with that one job in mind. I have gotten calls where the expectation is that I am going to show up with the crew, even if it's a smaller crew, but I've also gotten plenty of calls where they expect me to just show up and do it myself. And I have done that, right? And those of you listening to this podcast, a great number of you, if not most of you, probably have done plenty of interviews by yourself. And if you're taking any time to light the interview, you're setting up flags for diffusing light or creating negative fill, maybe you're splashing light on a wall, maybe you're using gobos to create shadows, maybe you're bringing a boom mic, maybe a lapel, boom and lapel together at the same time. Like, you're doing all this stuff, and if you're doing it by yourself, you know how much work that is and how hard that is to do on your own. And then to also co-direct or even fully direct the interview and come home and dump everything and organize everything and make sure that you edit the project together and make it make sense and sound good and flow well. And, that's a lot for a single person to do. But there is an expectation, it seems, with a lot of companies that 1 to 2 people should be able to do that today. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are many of us who have elected to take on those jobs because we need the work. I've taken on plenty of jobs like that. I mean, there was a series of videos I did every year for a while for my alma mater, my university I went to, where I would show up and have to shoot like 17 interviews over the course of like 3 or 4 days, and then also stay for a few extra days to shoot a bunch of B-roll to cut together these videos for a gala that was taking place. And I would have loved to have brought more people, but the budget just wasn't there. I could have said no to the job, but I also have a wife and 3 kids at the house. At the time I had 2. Now I have, a 3-month-old. So I have 3 kids at the house now. I've got a mortgage. I've got this new truck I bought a few weeks ago. I've talked about in the podcast, the last couple of podcasts. I got to pay for that. You have all these things that you got to pay for. And so you have to ask yourself, like, man, do I say no to that job on principle because that should be done by numerous people? Or do I take the job because I need the work to be able to sustain my job or sustain, my company, my business, and be able to provide for my family? And I know what my wife would say. My wife would look at me and say, I know you don't feel like this should be done by one person, but if hey, we've got bills to pay. And so you have to start asking yourself, like, at what point do you say no, or do you bend and say, I got to do it? So many of us, myself included, do it because we got to be able to pay the bills, right? But it's this trend that I keep seeing where there's this expectation that one person or a small team can do everything. And it doesn't always match reality. And I want to talk about some examples, real world examples of jobs I've lost this year. And I'm being a little vulnerable on this podcast, but I want to talk about jobs I've lost this year because there's this crazy expectation that either me and one other person are going to show up and do all of these things by ourselves, and it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit within the confines of reality of this job. And I want to talk about those examples and why this is a trend I'm seeing and why this is a not good trend. And we'll end the podcast by talking about my theories on whether we can bounce back from this or not. So let's dive into kind of the first example. Toward the beginning of the year, I was off in West Texas working on a project. And while I was there, I was getting some emails and eventually had a phone call with this really large corporate company that was going to be having a big event in Dallas. And not every job I'm going to talk about today is a corporate job, but the first 2 or 3 examples are going to be, because that is probably where I'm seeing this happening the most. But there are some other examples we're going to dive into as well. So if you are not doing corporate work, skip ahead. But in this first example, I got a call from this really large corporate company that was going to be hosting this big event at the Fairmont in Austin. And they were looking for someone to come and shoot photo and video of this event, make a recap video, edit the photos together, make a photo gallery. And this event was kind of elaborate. It wasn't the most elaborate event. Like I have one we'll talk about here later in the podcast that was definitely more elaborate than this. But it still was kind of an elaborate event in terms that there were multiple rooms that different presenters were going to be presenting in at the same time. And then there was like vendors and all these other things like step and repeats that were set up. And they were looking for someone who was going to go to all those rooms and document those presentations from a video standpoint and a photo standpoint, and then create a gallery as well as an event recap video afterward. And during this discussion, they kept saying this person, this person, this person. And I finally was like, I asked the question, I was like, are you looking for just like one person to do this? And they said, well, yeah, we budgeted for someone to come from a company and do this for us. And I was like, well, what you're wanting is not really feasible for one person. And this lady I was speaking to, who was from the marketing team, she's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, when you're explaining this event to me, there's like all these presentations that are taking place at this same time. How do you expect that person to be in all those different places? And she said, well, the way we have it scheduled is that you'll have like 10 minutes in one room, and then you'll run over to this other room, you'll have 10 minutes there, and then you'll run over to this other one, have 10 minutes there, and you're going to basically do that all day. And I was like, so let me get this straight. You're going to give that individual, a single individual, 10 minutes per room during all the presentations that are going to take place throughout the day to capture both video and stills in a 10-minute time span. So you're thinking like 5 or 6 minutes for video and like 4 or 5 minutes for stills. And she's like, yeah, exactly. And I was like, ma'am, I want you to understand. And I said, maybe this is something that you haven't done before. And I was like, but those are two different jobs. Like, and I tried to explain, like, typically on a project like that, like for the video portion, of course she doesn't know cameras, but I was trying to explain to her, like, we have dedicated cameras for that, which I know internally was the FX6, FX3. Like, that's what I would use for covering the event coverage stuff. But then for photo work, I would use dedicated photo cameras with a dedicated photographer. And she's like, well, can't you just use one camera that can do both? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, technically, and in my mind, again, she doesn't know cameras, but for those of y'all listening to the podcast, I do have an A1 Mark II and an original A1. So in theory, I have cameras that could handle both roles. I mean, technically, you could do both roles on an FX3, although I don't know if I've ever taken a picture in the FX3. It's just not, to me, it's not a photo camera. So from this perspective, I would be using, if I was going to do that job from a hybrid point of view, I would have to be using an A1 or A1 Mark II, or maybe both of them. But I still try to explain to her, I was like, yeah, I mean, while we do have a pair of cameras that physically can handle both tasks, there's still two completely different tasks. Because like one camera might be rigged up for a gimbal, and then the other camera might have a long lens on it on a tripod for getting shots of the speaker. And then you're talking about having to remove that from the tripod or remove the other camera from the gimbal or both, go to photo mode and change all these different settings. Like she doesn't understand, but from my mind, you're changing shutter speed and, anything else, or maybe your focus points or whatever. And I was like, so it takes time to do. And it's also two different mindsets, right? Like there are two different mindsets towards video and stills and the way that you capture them. I mean, you can kind of make them complement each other, but it's still two different mindsets. And I was like, that's like a really tall order for one person to do. And she's like, so what do you suggest? I said, well, I really suggest you have two people, like at a minimum, at the bare minimum, you need one person there doing video, one person there doing stills. And I said, but even then you're really asking a lot because you're only giving them 10 minutes per room. And she was like, why do you need more than 10 minutes? So I was like, well, typically on an event recap video, you're going to want to get a mixture of shots. You might want to get a tripod, long lens, compressed shot of someone speaking at a podium. Then you might want to go get a handheld shot from behind a crowd and get them, like, as they're looking at the person who's speaking. You might want to turn around and actually get some crowd shots. You might get a gimbal shot that's establishing the room. Like the variety of shots you might want to get there. And similarly, the photographer is going to want to do kind of the same thing. I mean, they're not going to have the movement, but they're going to want to get compressed shots and wide shots and shots of the crowd and shots of the room and stuff like that. And I was like, and probably from different angles. And like, it takes a little bit of time. And she was like, well, you could send me a bid for both, but I can tell you that, internally my boss is going to want us to just have one person. And she's like, we've had one person do this in the past, so we know it can be done by one person. And I'm thinking to myself, well, there's a reason why you're not calling that person back, right? It's probably because you weren't happy with what they gave you. And that's probably because you had that person try to do all these different roles. You know what I mean? But the expectation was it could be done. They liked my work. They wanted me to do it. And I ultimately was like, just to be honest, if you like my work, you're not going to get that level with me trying to do all these things at once. It's just not feasible. That expectation was outpacing the reality. And they had a huge amount of needs for photography. Essentially what they were looking to do was have general event coverage all 3 days of every facet of the event. So there were going to be people speaking in different rooms at different times. There was going to be awards handed out. There was going to be a step and repeat where people were going to be taking photographs in front of a step and repeat. There was going to be a headshot station where people at designated times were going to come get professional headshots done. They wanted receptions captured. I mean, all of these things. And to top it off, they needed same day delivery of photographs, not the whole photo gallery, but they needed a certain number of images each day to go to social media. And then on top of that, they needed on the final day to have all 3 days worth of imagery culled through and edited and put into a slideshow that was going to play at the final award ceremony kind of banquet thing they were having, where they could have all the event that was documented over the 3-day period being replayed throughout this slideshow. So you're talking needing to shoot the event, needing to shoot headshots, step and repeats, capture awards, capture presenters, do same day delivery on a select number of photos every day, as well as final delivery of all the photos on the last day to go into this slideshow that we also were asked to make. So I'm looking at this job, and as I'm reading through this email, and it was a laundry list of items, I kept seeing this thing that was popping up throughout the email, which was the photographer, the photographer, the photographer. So I looked at that and I was like, there's no way. And I ended up having a quick call with this company, and I was like, hey, I noticed that you were looking to have this done by a photographer. Is that really what you were looking for? And they were like, yes, we want one photographer who's going to be able to do all this. And I'm like, that is a lot for one photographer. Like, take the headshots, for example. Like, you're a headshot station. They even specifically said like a well-lit headshot station with professional lighting and a professional backdrop. I'm like, well, that's going to take time to set up, and then someone's going to have to be there to take those photos. And they were wanting us to keep up with whose photo went with who. And so I was looking at this, and I was like, I told her, I was like, man, like, how is that going to work? And she's like, well, what it is we're going to have a window of time for you to set up your lighting. And then you're going to have a window of time after this one speaking presentation done where you can sprint down there, take the headshots, and then we'll sprint to lunch. You'll sprint back, take some more headshots, and then sprint over to the next spot to get started on another speaking seminar. And I was like, man, like, that's a tall order for one person. And I said, plus all the same day edits. And they're like, well, we had an in-house photographer who did it last year, so we know it can be done by one person. And this is kind of like that previous example I gave. And I was like, well, ma'am, I'm not sure, what happened with that person or why you're not using them again. But I can tell you from my perspective, this really needs to be done by multiple people. And she's like, okay, well, send us a bid. And I got off. And again, I'm thinking to myself, there's a reason why you're calling me to do this and not using the person you used last time, right? Because you had a certain level of expectation. You tried to get it done by one person, and then something probably went wrong. You probably were not happy with the time frame of which they delivered stuff. Maybe they didn't have it done in time. Maybe the images were not good quality. I don't know what it is, but there is a reason why you're now calling me. And I can tell you, like, this needs to be done by at least 2 people, at least. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to get it if I bid it with more than 3 people. So I'll bid it as a 2-person team. So, and I even, to be competitive, made it to where I was like, day 1 is just general event coverage. I'll just have one person, myself, I'll do that day. But I'm going to bring another photographer for days 2 and 3, who's going to be, and that person's going to be in charge of the headshots, the step and repeat shots, and the same day editing, as well as the total photo editing. And I'll just like do my own DIT work. I'll dump all the stuff and organize it and hand it to that person so they can do the headshots, do the step and repeats, and edit. That way we can hit our timing markers. So I sent the bid at 2 people. And they came back to me and said, well, hey, can you come down by like $500 to hit our budget for this job? And I was like, okay, fine. So I agreed to that. Well, then they messaged me up a little while later, maybe a day or 2 later, and were like, actually, you now only have to get there like an hour or 2 later every day. Can we cut the price even more? And I was like, well, whether I come, don't have to be there for an hour or 2 later than you originally thought, I'm still there all day. I mean, these were like 11, 12-hour days. plus staying and editing. So we're talking 13, 14 plus hour days. And I'm like, ma'am, like cutting an hour or two at the beginning of the day in the grand scheme of things doesn't really change much. There are still very long days that are in some cases going till 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. Like the price is going to have to stay the same. And I ended up not getting the job. They wanted to go a different direction. And it was because they really wanted it to be done by one person and they wanted to continue to cut costs. And I'm like, this is just like, who would do that? Who's doing this job as a single person? And obviously doing it for not a lot of money. I mean, I asked for a decent amount of money, but obviously they were looking for something cheaper and they just wanted one person to do it. And like, so there's someone out there who's going to do that job for probably not a lot of money and who's going to be doing it all on their own. And I'm just like, man, like I don't understand. And I did bid it. I mean, it was an expensive price, but I thought I bid it aggressively. Like I didn't charge overtime for hours going over 10 hours, which I normally do, in order to stay competitive with my bid. And then on top of that, when asked to come down that extra $500, I was willing to do it. But then it got to a point where it's like, well, can you come down more if we cut an hour or two at the beginning? It's like, no, this is what it costs to do this job. And I lost it over that. Or I guess not over that, but that plus the fact I wanted another photographer. And so it's just like, dude, like your expectations here again are outpacing the reality of what you're looking for. And I would not be surprised if they run into a similar experience where next year they're looking for someone else once again, because what they're wanting is not realistic, or at least not if they want good quality and they want someone who's not going to get burned out and hate doing this and who's not going to want to do it again. Well, let's talk about another one. Let's talk about a documentary, kind of shift things up a little bit. I got asked for a quote to do this very elaborate fly fishing dock project. It was going to take place all over Colorado. And I won't get into too many details because if I did, it might give away who the client was. But it was this organization that was looking for this elaborate multiple day documentation of this big fly fishing competition thing that was going to be happening in Colorado that they wanted to document. Again, I'm not going to say what the competition was because it might be a giveaway, but there was going to be basically this like 3 or 4 or 5 day, I can't remember how many days it was, but it was really, it was a handful of days and it was going to take place all over the state of Colorado. And it was a very elaborate project and they wanted to shoot interviews. They wanted to shoot B-roll footage for the backstory of the people who were competing in this event. And then on top of that, shoot the event itself and all the B-roll that goes with it, infill dialogue throughout the event, etc. And I'm sitting here, I'm looking at this, and I'm like, okay, this is a really expensive project because we're going to have either multiple crews that can be in different parts of Colorado at once, or we're going to have a very nimble crew that can move throughout the state every day. But in either way, we're going to need a bunch of people to pull this off. We're going to need, because it was a lot of moving parts. I was like, we're going to need someone who's going to be handling DIT work and charging batteries and that kind of stuff because the rest of the team is going to be on the move constantly all day long before sunup to after sunset. So we need a designated person who's going to grab the gear, charge it, dump footage and all that throughout the day while we're in these remote locations while the rest of the team's documenting everything. So that's a crew member. We're going to need a DP. That DP might have to operate a camera, so we're going to need to be nimble, so we can stay nimble. We're going to need that. We're probably going to need 1 or 2 other videographers. And, I was like, we probably need a sound guy. But even then, even if we did our own sound, like trying to think about it here, like what is the smallest crew I could get away with? And to me, it was like 4 people. I needed like 2 videographers plus myself, like DPing, directing the job, and also helping run camera. And then a DIT who's also doing and managing batteries and whatnot. And on top of that, we may or may not have needed someone who's going to be responsible for shuttling people around, who's going to be like in a chase car, because these people are going to be moving through the mountains, and we kind of needed somebody who could follow along with the equipment in a vehicle the whole time. And so, it was going to take a bunch of people to pull this off. And so we start talking about this and we start figuring out, kind of what the budget's going to be. It took a while to kind of figure that out because there's a lot of moving parts. But once I kind of came up with an idea on a bare bones, like this is the range of what it's going to cost, this is the cheapest it could cost. Here's going to be what I think it should cost if we want it to be a little more polished, have a few additional people that might be on the southern part of the state. So one team is not responsible for everything, but if you only want it to be one team, here's what that would look like. And so I had like a cost breakdown so they could kind of look at it and evaluate it. And we weren't even remotely on the same planet, not even remotely. They were looking at that and they were like, boy, that's a lot of zeros. And I'm like, not really. And they were like, well, we were kind of thinking about, just getting one or two guys to do it. And one guy was like, maybe I could just grab a camera and do it myself. Actually, I've got a GoPro and a handy cam or something. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you're an organization that contacted me to do this professional grade documentary about this event, and now we've gone from that to you're just going to grab your GoPro and your Handycam and run out and shoot this. Like, what'd you expect? Of course this was going to cost a lot of money. And they just, like, their expectation of what they were looking to do was not even remotely close to what was realistic. And once again, I didn't even put together a proposal because they were so blown away by the price. We never even, like, there was no point in sending a proposal. Like, it was very obvious that wasn't going to happen. I'll give you another example. A couple of years ago, a couple years ago, I got contacted, and this is kind of when this was not this year. I've talked about how this has been a trend that keeps evolving every year, but I'll give you a really big example where a couple years ago, I got a call for this really elaborate doc project. It was going to take place in Texas prisons, and I was going to have to go to the big prison in Huntsville, Texas, and film with inmates. Some of them were on death row. Some of them were not on death row. They were, but they were there for life. And I was going to have to go film interviews with them, as well as get like day-to-day life with them. And it was going to take place over the course of like 6 months. And I was going to have to make trips like every 2 weeks to, or another operator with a small crew were going to have to take trips every couple weeks to this prison to document all of this stuff that we were supposed to be filming. And I'm not going to say again what all we were doing here because it might give away a little too much information about this, but just know it took place at a Texas prison. And then on top of that, we were going to recreate some scenes to go with it. So as a documentary that was going to have like recreates. And then on top of that, so that meant like finding locations, potentially renting locations, and then having to find actors for the recreates. And then on top of that, like when we're filming in the prison, it couldn't just be one person. It needed to be at least two people, right? Because we were going into a live prison with people, and we couldn't bring a huge crew. But we needed at least one extra person to be there to help manage gear and sound and stuff, because we couldn't make multiple trips back and forth to the truck. Think about it. We're going into prison. You can get in once, and and anything we bring to get into this prison is going to have to be what we can carry. And there's even then there's going to be some limitations. So I'm like, I at least have to have another camera operator who can help me manage sound, or that person is going to have to at the very least be a production assistant. But in either way, like, we can't make multiple trips back and forth to the truck. It's a prison. So I need at least one other person. And so we started talking through this thing, and I started figuring out, okay, what is the most nimble crew I can put together for the prison scenes? What's it going to look like for the recreates, which it's hard for me to guesstimate because we were too early in the project for me to know what the recreates were going to exactly look like. But I put like a budget there, like, okay, we could put this aside for recreates and we could just pull from that budget as the doc goes on. And then they were asking for, I forgot what else it was, but it was like a bunch of other things that they wanted to do, like going to the homes of the family members' homes of the people that were in prison and getting interviews with them. And, we were just putting together this really big story. And again, I'm not going to say what all this was about because it could give it away, but just know, like, I'm looking at this really elaborate project, and the idea was this is a company that had put together films that had made it to either Netflix or Amazon Prime in the past. So they were wanting to put together this doc, and then they were going to try to sell it, was the idea. I wasn't involved in any of that. I was just the company that was going to execute it. We were going to direct it, shoot it, edit it, work on the scripting with the client. We were just in charge of the production. Okay, so I'm not involved in any way, shape, or form, or we weren't, with the distribution of it, the sale of it, or anything like that. So from my perspective and what it would cost, I put a ballpark figure on it, because that's what they wanted, was just give me a ballpark figure. So I gave them a ballpark figure, and it had a little bit of a range. Oh, and by the way, this company specifically said to me, we want to shoot it on an Alexa Mini LF, or a pair of Alexa Mini LFs. So you can kind of get an idea, if you know anything about video, that kind of gives you an idea of the expectation of what they were going for. They had a specific camera in mind, which meant they had a specific level of quality in mind. And again, they were going to try to sell this to a platform. And so I'm pricing it as such. Like, I didn't ask for tens of millions of dollars, but I had to think about that. Like, okay, there's a certain expectation of what they're looking for. I'm going to put together my estimated budget range based on that expectation, the gear they want us to rent, the crew size that we're going to need for the prison, the crew size that I think we're going to need for the recreates, which again, I don't fully know what those are going to look like yet. And so I'm putting together like just an estimated range of what I think we could execute the production for this video would be, or this documentary would be. And so I put it together, and we had a meeting, and they looked at this and they're like, that is extremely high. We have to cut that cost way, 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 way down. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they started kind of telling me what their numbers were. And they were, again, we weren't even on the same planet. And I'm like, you came to me like, you've done this before multiple times, and I knew that they had, because I looked it up, and they actually had. So I'm like, you've done this before, you know how these things work. You had a specific camera in mind, even, that we were going to have to obviously rent and bring on these shoots. They even had a certain lens set that they were looking at. And I'm like, so you knew this is going to cost money. How are we so far apart from each other? And they're like, well, we're just going to look for a local Texas guy who can go into the prisons with that camera and do it. And I'm like, well, one, that's asking a lot of one person. And two, like, what one person can afford to rent that camera and take it into a prison every other week for the price that you're wanting for like 6 months? Like, there's just no way. And then on top of that, have like recreated scenes with actors, do post-production on it, all this stuff. Like, it didn't even make sense. Like, their expectations were completely unrealistic. And I keep seeing this pop up every year, and it's like every year that progresses, I see more and more and more of this. And really, for me, it all started with the hunting industry. For those of you who follow me or have followed me, you might know that my start in video production was in the hunting industry. I produced hunting shows, nationally televised hunting shows, for a living. I did it full time as a job. That was when I was in between companies, my first original company and Rustic River Media. I took a period of time off where I ran my companies on the side, and I worked full time as a producer for a television show. And then I've also freelanced on top of that. And it started back then, where I noticed a trend. Back in the day, hunting shows used to be filmed on ENG style video cameras. There never were like a lot of crew members involved in a hunting show. Sometimes you might have a small skeleton crew, but for the most part, it was like one person or 1 to 2 people would film these shows, because you're taking people into the backcountry who are responsible for filming you getting close enough to an animal that you're trying to pursue, and then documenting the kill of that animal, the recovery of that animal, and the pack out of that animal. And so you can't bring a full crew in a situation like that, because you're never going to get close to the animal, right? Not from a hunting standpoint. And so back in the day, those shows were shot, I mean, a long time ago, they were shot on beta cams and things like that. And then as technology evolved, they moved to more ENG style video cameras, like EX3s from Sony, AX2000s, Panasonic P2s. If you don't know what any of those are, you can look them up. But these are cameras that were really popular about 14, 15 years ago. And those cameras were cameras that had, dual card slots. They had 2 audio inputs, one for your shotgun mic and one for lapel for the hunter. Or maybe you would skip the shotgun mic and have 2 lapels, one for hunter, one for guide. And you had built-in ND filters. You had, and most importantly, you had a built-in servo zoom lens. These were small sensor cameras, but they had huge zoom ranges, like full frame equivalent of like 28 millimeters to like 400 something like that. I mean, depending on the camera model, but big range. And people would use a camera like that to film everything. And it was perfect because you could get a wide shot of people hiking through the mountains. You could get a close-up shot, or relatively speaking, close-up shot of the animal. And then in one single take, you could get someone like shooting the animal, and as it runs off, they use the zoom rocker and they pull back out on the zoom and get on the hunter who's now like showing some sort of emotion. Either they're showing a positive emotion because they just got the animal that they've been working all week to get, or maybe it's a sad emotion like, oh my gosh, I messed that shot up. And so in one camera, in one take, you could get the shot, follow the animal running off, zoom back out with that zoom rocker and get the emotion or reaction. And it was very practical for one person to film all that. And even if you had a second person, that second person was helping you document everything, or they were helping to Sherpa stuff like carry equipment and things like that. But a lot of that stuff was shot by one person, one camera guy. They call them, field producers. So what I noticed was back in the day when I was producing hunting shows, that was still kind of the equipment that was being used, but the industry was starting to shift. It was shifting because the Canon 5D Mark II and then eventually Canon 5D Mark III came out. And technically speaking, Nikon started this whole DSLR revolution because they were the first ones that had like a full frame DSLR camera that had video recording capabilities. Unfortunately for them, Canon became more popular and really took the industry by storm. So everybody thinks of the 5D2, 5D3. And sure enough, in the hunting space, that caught on like wildfire. There was a bow hunting show that's still around called Heartland Bow Hunter, and they started filming a lot of their scenes and then eventually entire episodes off of 5D2 or 5D3 camera bodies. And what they found was that the image quality looked dramatically different than it did with these small sensor video cameras. Obviously, because they're big sensors, you can use different lenses with them, get that shallow depth of field look, get better low light performance, etc. And it was very unique, and it put a whole different spin on the image quality of what you could get shooting a hunting show. The problem, though, is that their show, the way it was filmed, most of it was people were bow hunting out of tree stands or ground blinds. And so that was a little more practical, right? But when you start talking about filming like a rifle hunt in the mountains where you got to pack out, an interchangeable lens full frame or at least Super 35 camera and the appropriate lenses, it becomes a little less practical because now you need like a long lens to film the wildlife. But unless you're running one of those crappy super zooms, that's probably not going to be a good lens choice for filming the hiking sequences, the glassing sequences, the interaction between hunters or hunter and guide. So you either need a whole separate camera body and a separate lens to do that, or you do need to run one of those big old super zooms, but those are still really heavy and they're front heavy and you're putting it on a small mirrorless or DSLR at that time body. And so it would be very unbalanced and it just became not very practical. But everybody saw what Heartland Bow Hunter was doing and was like, hey, we want that. Like that looks cool. We want to put that on our show. And so this new expectation became, forget the video cameras. We're going to shoot everything off of DSLRs. And then eventually that became mirrorless cameras. And some people were still running things like, there was a period of time where people were running like F5s, then FS7s, and some people had FS5s and eventually became FX6, FX9, FX3. So there were some of those cameras involved as well, but all of them took interchangeable lens, large sensor cameras. And that problem was, and this is how it has to do with the podcast, was that the expectation, I felt, outpaced what was reality. So like, for example, say you were on a spot and stock rifle late season elk hunt in Colorado and you're trudging through the snowy mountains there trying to get a late season elk tag punched. If you are a single person filming that on an interchangeable lens camera, that is extremely difficult because you need some sort of long lens to get the rifle shot of the elk. But then you also need to be able to capture the rest of the hunt. People hiking, people glassing, people communicating together, brainstorming, planning, figuring out how they're going to get over a saddle or a ridge. And how are you supposed to do that on one interchangeable lens camera? Well, you could, but it's really not practical. So you really need to run two camera bodies. So now you're trying to juggle two different cameras at the same time, which, by the way, you got to pack all your batteries for, lenses for, filters for, all that on your back every day, and you're trying to juggle two camera systems to make it work, or use one camera with a crappy super zoom that's unbalanced, or recreate everything, which is not very practical because at the end of the day, after the animal is down, nobody wants to go back and pretend like they're hiking and glassing again. Like you might be able to do some recreates, but you're not going to be able to recreate a whole 21.5-minute television show, right? You need to capture a lot of that stuff as it's unfolding. And so it just became like this juggling act of like, how are you supposed to pull that off as a single individual? If you had at least two people, it would be a little different, right? One person could have a long lens and be focused on the animal, and another person could have a wider lens that could be focused on the action. But so many shows did not want to spend the money on that. They just wanted one person who would do it all. They would run all the sound. They would get all the long lens wildlife stuff. They'd get all the wide angle shots of everybody hiking, glassing, and all that stuff. And so juggling two cameras, doing all their own audio, carrying their own tripod, maybe even bringing a drone or a gimbal to add to the shot selection. And they're directing, if they're actually film producing, they're directing it and thinking of the edit sequence in their head. And so this one person is responsible of all of these tasks while also packing all that stuff out in the mountains. The expectation just was not realistic. And at the same time, budgets were dropping because more and more and more and more people wanted to get into the industry because, content creation was becoming a really popular thing and everybody wanted to get involved in content creation, especially in the hunting and fishing world, because there are a lot of us out there, myself included, who are big outdoorsmen who want to find a way to work in that environment on a daily basis and get paid for it. And so many people, again, myself included, were like, hey, media is a good way to do that. But what happened is so many people decided that they would take a pay cut and be willing to work for a few $100 a day to get their foot in the door. And they would do that juggling act of carrying all that stuff up the mountain. And so, and they would eventually find that it didn't work. Like they weren't making enough money. The job was like the expectation there didn't make sense. They'd start to ask for more money. Well, the show's already got a taste of you working at cheap rates. So they're going to kick you to the curb and find the next cheap guy. And it killed the industry, in my opinion. It's really hard to make good money as a field producer. And you can make money in other ways, but it's really hard as a field producer to make money in that space today because of that, because people are only wanting to pay $300, $400, $500 a day, which is not a lot of money for you to juggle two camera systems and bring a gimbal and a drone and your own audio and do all of this stuff. And back when there was no drones and no gimbals and the cameras that were used were video cameras, that was different. That was different. But now that this is the new norm, the interchangeable lens norm, the drone norm, the gimbal norm, and you got to do it all norm, it killed the industry, especially with the prices coming down. And so, again, that's another, in my opinion, great example of when expectations outpace reality. And that's why for me, as much as I love hunting and fly fishing and on the coast and all that stuff, I had to find other ways to work in those spaces, doing marketing content, because the show side of it just didn't make any sense. It was just unrealistic. And also, again, back to the whole social media thing or content creation thing, those shows also wanted you to take pictures so they could have social media content. They want you to edit those photos, get them out the door immediately. You're working 16, 18 plus hour days almost every day throughout hunting season to do all those jobs as one person. That expectation outpaces reality. And that's why the majority of friends I had that were in that space like me left, because we realized like, hey, we're gone away from our home and our wives, our kids for months at a time. And we're not making the kind of money we should be making. And we are trying to do like 25 things at once. And we're killing ourselves over here. It just doesn't make sense. Like that is what drove me to commercial work, corporate work, event coverage, political work, live streaming. I jumped down those avenues because I realized how unrealistic the hunting field producer thing was. But you could see like this was a trend. It started with, okay, now we're going to use interchangeable lens cameras. And then it was, okay, now we're going to add drones. Then it was, okay, now we're going to add gimbal. Now we want you to do photography too. And it started, I saw it when it started with a hunting space. And then I watched it as it evolved into corporate stuff and things like that. Like what I just explained at the beginning of the podcast, like these corporate event coverage examples where it's just like, I'm seeing it everywhere now. Like it's not just the hunting field producer thing. I'm seeing it at all levels where literally billion-dollar companies that I work with are like, yeah, we want one person to do everything. Like, what? No, like, dude, you've got the money for it. Why should we be given extra expectations and you not like be willing to meet us there? Like it's going to take more people to do what you want to do. It's going to cost more. But it just seems like I've noticed where so many companies don't see it that way. They're like, well, we have a higher demand for content. We need more content creation, but we're not going to increase our budgets to match that increased expectation. That has been the trend that I have been seeing, and it is concerning to me. Now, I said at the beginning of the podcast that I'm going to wrap this up with where I see this going, and do I see this correcting itself? And here's kind of what I see. I've only given you a few examples. I've seen a lot of this in my work, and have been working with a lot of different proposals over this past year where I have been seeing this happen again and again and again. Most of it's been with corporate companies, but I've seen it in other places as well. And so it's always been a trend, but it is definitely a trend that seems to be picking up steam. That said, I don't think it's sustainable. I think that the reason corporate companies are asking for it is because they're finding people who are willing to take on these jobs with little to no other crew, and that are willing to juggle the task of photo and video and editing and all this stuff. They're finding people who are willing to do that and do it by themselves. But as we've seen, or at least as I've seen, those companies, something goes wrong, because those companies are reaching out to other people like myself the next year asking for new bids. Why are they not going back to that same person? And I think the reason is because people are either getting burned out, they're learning that it's too much to ask, so they're asking for more money, they're wanting to bring more people, right? Or what they delivered either wasn't on time or wasn't to the expectation of what the client was expecting. And so the client's now trying to work with someone else who maybe will match that expectation. But I think that that's not sustainable. I do think at some point, companies and brands are going to start to realize that they are not able to consistently find the level of quality that they're wanting for the budget that they want and the crew size that they want. I do think they're going to start to see where people are just going to not take those jobs anymore because they're realizing what a butt kicker that is, or people are going to be asking for more money or wanting to bring on more crew. Shows are going to continue, or not shows, but corporate companies are going to continue to push back until there's nobody left to push back against. And so I do think at some point this will correct itself. The question is, how long do we have until that happens? The only outlier is maybe cell phones, right? Because there are companies out there that are like, well, we'll just shoot all the social media images on our phone. Now, that doesn't concern me too much, because I do think there is a difference. I think clients still know that there's a difference. And I think that some social media being done on phones is actually a good thing because it's authentic. And I think for certain brands, that's a good thing to have. But professional image quality is still also very much an important part of marketing. Some of it depends on what it is you're marketing. I guess there's that. But I think for a lot of brands, big brands, a lot of corporate companies, they're looking for a healthy mix of both. Like, let's do some like quick story stuff on our phones, or maybe like a quick, picture of us at the office on our phones. But then for their branded work, they still are going to want, the higher end stuff. So I even then, I don't think phones are going to like really replace anything. But I do think that what is going to happen is they're going to try to do stuff themselves in-house. They're going to realize that it's not going to be to the level that they want it to be. So then they're going to want to find companies like my company to do it. They're going to have these unrealistic expectations that we're seeing right now. But then they're eventually going to realize that their expectations are going to have to shift. Either they're going to have to pay more, or they're going to have to ask for less stuff, or at least less stuff for one person or a small crew to do. But the question is, how long is that going to take for that ship to be corrected? Because right now I'm seeing it going the opposite way, and it's been going the opposite way for quite some time. But this year has been, in my mind, or at least in my experience, this year has been the worst year I've ever experienced by far with these expectations. I have gotten, I don't even know how many requests for quotes this year for very, very elaborate things. And have lost a lot of those jobs because they were wanting a very small crew or even one person to do it all, and they weren't wanting or willing to pay more, or they weren't willing to adjust their expectations. And I've never really experienced a year like this where I have lost so many jobs to that one specific thing, but it has happened many times to me this year, more than just these examples I've given. And it's frustrating and it's concerning, but I don't think it's sustainable. I do think it will go the other direction at some point. The big question is when, and can you hang on long enough to see that happen? I do think there are segments of the market. I do a lot of like interview work, branded content, like interview B-roll type stuff that I don't think that's going anywhere. And they don't, they might be expecting smaller crews today and for you to come in and have a small crew that can handle many hats. And maybe they do want it all done by one person. As mentioned earlier, my alma mater wanted me to do a bunch of interviews by myself. And I did take on those jobs because reality is I needed the work. Plus it was my alma mater and it was a cool job and I did enjoy it. But I killed myself to produce that. And you could make the argument, Josh, don't take it because that's what's killing the industry. And I actually agree. I agree wholeheartedly. But I got 3 kids. I got a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 3-month-old. I've got a mortgage. I've got health insurance I have to pay for. I have a stay-at-home wife. At some point, I can't keep saying no to jobs. At some point, I got to put food on the table. You know what I mean? So, I did take it, and I've taken other jobs like that, and I know many of you listening to this podcast have. But I do think that there is going to be a point of which some of that slows down a little bit, where people are going to start to realize, like, okay, maybe we are asking a bit much here for one person. Maybe they do that job with you, and they see how hard it is for you to do, and maybe they're not able to get as much B-roll shots as they wanted because it's taking you so long to unpack and get all of the interviews shot and then pack it all back up, whatever it is. I do think at some point there's going to be a bounce back where these things are going to start to correct themselves. We just got to hope that it happens sooner rather than later. Thanks, guys, for listening to this podcast. I appreciate you tuning in. What have you noticed in your industry that you're doing video or photo work in? Have you seen this trend as well? If so, let me know. If not, let me know. Go to Filming with Josh on Facebook, ask to join the group, and comment on the post of this podcast or create a new post there, or hop on Instagram or any of the other places that you are seeing this posted at, and leave us a comment and let us know what you're seeing. If you are new to the podcast, please like the podcast and follow it. Maybe give us a rating. I would really appreciate it. It helps get this out to more people like you. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you all next week.
To learn more about Rustic River Media, visit us online at rusticriver.media. Thanks for listening to the Filming with Josh podcast. Catch every episode by hitting subscribe today.